I'm glad to introduce you Sami Khatib. We all know Sami is a founding member of the Beirut Institute of Critical Analysis and Research, and among his publications, we report, for example, Teleology on the Anzac and many articles about Benjamin, but also Tactilism and Karl Marx. And among his more recent publication, the co-authorship of the Crisis, the Stakes of Paul and Lisa.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Martin, for making this possible. Very happy to be back in Ljubljana, and thanks for Goethe Institute for hosting us here. These are difficult times to speak at a German institution, to put it mildly, but all the more we are thankful to be welcomed here. The paper that I originally envisioned, I couldn't write as always. The abstract is more of wishful thinking. I just read, I wanted to even tackle Edward Said, Benjamin, he goes better with Adorno actually. Many other things, but also it was interrupted through the discovery of the work of Furio Yesi. When we had the Bikar Summer School this year, which in Beirut could not take place for the obvious reasons, the threat of an Israeli attack, which now actually happens, we had an online summer school, and Alberto Toscano gave a longer speech, and he quoted at length from Yesi's book. So this prompted me to change a lot. But anyways, these are fragments that I put together, and let's talk about it afterwards. So if you stop me after 40 minutes, there's no real ending to it. You can just say finito. Okay, I will start with a long quote. My friend, never shall I forget Nadia's leg, amputated from the top of the thigh. No, nor shall I forget the grief which had molded her face and merged into its traits forever. I went out to the hospital in Gaza that day, my hand clutched in silent derision on 2 pounds that I had brought with me to give Nadia. The blazing sun filled the street with the color of blood. And Gaza was brand new, Mustafa. You and I never saw it like this. The stone, piled up at the beginning of the Sharia quarter, where I lived, had a meaning, and they seemed to have been put there for no other reason but to explain it. This Gaza in which we had lived and with whose good people we had spent 7 years of defeat was something new. It seemed to me just the beginning. I don't know why I thought it was just the beginning. I imagined that the main street that I walked alone on the way back home was only the beginning of a long, long road leading to Safed. Everything in this Gaza throbbed with sadness, which was not confined to weeping. It was a challenge. More than that, it was something like reclamation of the amputated leg. I went out into the streets of Gaza, streets filled with blinding sunlight. They told me that Nadia had lost her leg when she threw herself on top of her little brothers and sisters to protect them from the bombs and flames that had fastened their claws into the house. Nadia could have saved herself. She could have run away, rescued her leg, but she didn't. Why? No, my friend, I won't come to Sacramento, and I have no regrets. No, and nor will I finish what we began together in childhood. This obscure feeling that you had as you left Gaza, this small feeling must grow into a giant deep within you. It must expand and must seek it in order to find yourself here among the ugly debris of defeat. I won't come to you, but you return to us. Come back to learn from Nadia's leg, amputated from the top of the thigh, what life is and what existence is worth. Come back, my friend, we are all waiting for you. So this is the ending of a longer story, short stories, by Ghassan Kanafani. This is written in 1956. It's not from today. 1956. It's called a letter from Gaza, and it's included in the longer, also translated into English, volume Men from the Sun. So, again, Ghassan Kanafani, the famous Arab revolutionary writer, romancier, assassinated by the Mossad in 1972, I guess, in Beirut. Speaking from a non-defeatist position of defeat, 16 years earlier, in 1940, Walter Benjamin conceived history as an anachronic constellation of past and present, shot through with sparks of messianic time. What he calls Jetztzeit, or now time, are short circuits of past and present, resisting the progressive flow of homogeneous, empty time. Or according to this anti-evolutionary concept of history, you know that, of course, the past is never simply gone. It can never be fully historicized unless it is recalled or cited in a revolutionary way. Only if politics has the capacity to anticipate the kairos, the opportune moment for a tiger's leap into the past, the catastrophic course of history can be interrupted. In this way, history, historiography, and revolutionary action are inextricably intertwined. A neutral perspective, detached from political struggles, only leads to what he calls empathy with the victor. And the rulers at any time, as Benjamin reminds us, are the heirs of all those who have been victorious throughout history. Against this form of victor's history, be it historicist, progressivist, or evolutionist, Benjamin argued for a truly historical concept of history, aiming at the revolutionary encounter of past and present, accessible only for what he calls the struggling oppressed class. In this sense, the task of the materialist historiographer is both radically partisan and universal, and I quote from the notes on the thesis on the concept of history. And he writes, "The history-writing subject is properly that part of humanity whose solidarity embraces all the oppressed. It is the part which can take the greatest theoretical risks because, in practical terms, it has the least to lose." Again, he writes this in 1940. In this vein, Benjamin's thesis on the concept of history link universality, that is universal truth, the true image of the past and so on, to a particular position. We have it in the title, Generations of the Downtrodden, the negative subject of class struggle. And here we may read thesis 12 from On the Concept of History again. You know it probably, I would have projected it, but I read it out for you again. So the subject of historical cognition is the struggling oppressed class itself. Marx presents it as the last enslaved class, the avenger that completes the task of liberation in the name of generations of the downtrodden. This conviction, which had a brief resurgence in the Spartacus League, has always been objectable to social democrats. Within 3 decades, they managed to erase the name of Blanqui, August Blanqui, almost entirely through, though at the sound of that name, the preceding century, the 19th century, had quaked. The Social Democrats preferred to cast the working class in the role of a redeemer of future generations, in this way cutting the sinews of its greatest strength. This indoctrination made the working class forget both its hatred and its spirits of sacrifice, for both are nourished by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than by the ideal of liberated children. End of quote. This is thesis 12. Collective affects like hatred and spirit of sacrifice become, if you take the crypto-Kantian formulation of this thesis, the beginning of the thesis seriously, become the quasi-transcendental condition of possibility to access the true image of the past. So epistemology, political standpoint, and revolutionary struggle intersect here. Revolutionary politics is all about finding a past struggle, event or situation, crystallized in an image. You remember, the image flits by. If you don't catch it, it's gone forever. And realize its hidden truth in the moment of political action in the present. Only in the political struggle, the epiphany of the true image of the past is real. Another quote, which is Alternative Thesis 18, you know, the famous one found by Giorgio Agamben. I think he never gave it to the Benjamin archive. He only sent a copy. He found it in Paris. But it's also included in the selected writings. And Benjamin writes here, for the revolutionary thinker, the peculiar revolutionary chance offered by every historical moment gets its warrant from the political situation. But it is equally grounded for this thinker in the right of entry, I think in German, Schlüsselgewalt, right of entry that the historical moment enjoys vis-à-vis a quite distinct chamber of the past, one which up to that point has been closed and locked. The entrance into this chamber coincides in a strict sense with political action, and it is by means of such entry that political action, however destructive, reveals itself as messianic. In other papers, I wrote a long commentary on that. I will spare you with this, but I will change the subject here for a moment. Employing the language of symbol, symbolism, and mythology, the Italian historian and philosopher Furio Jesi came to a similar conclusion regarding universal truth and political struggle. And now I quote from his book on Spartacus uprising. The instant of revolt determines one's sudden self-realization and self-objectification as part of a collectivity. The battle between good and evil, between survival and death, between success and failure, in which everyone is individually involved each and every day, is identified with the battle of the whole collectivity. Everyone has the same weapons, everyone faces the same obstacles, the same enemy. Everyone experiences the epiphany of the same symbols. Everyone's individual space, dominated by one's personal symbols, by the shelter from historical time that everyone enjoys in their individual symbology and mythology, expands, becomes the symbolic space common to an entire collective, the shelter from historical time in which the collective finds safety. End of quote. Of course, if you really want to unpack it, now you have to immediately go back to Benjamin, Surrealism essay, and you look at image space, Bildraum of the political. I didn't have the time for that, but you know, it's more of a constellation that I put here together. Of course, we cannot miss Jesi's different take on revolution, which he distinguishes from the revolt and its peculiar experience of time. And again, it's a quote from the same text. Jesi says, I use the word revolt to designate an insurrectional movement that differs from revolution. The difference between revolt and revolution should not be sought in their respective aims. They can both have the same aim, to seize power. What principally distinguishes revolt from revolution is instead a different experience of time. If following the ordinary meaning of the two words, revolt is a sudden insurrectional explosion, which can be placed within a strategic horizon, but which does not in itself imply a long-distance strategy. And revolution is a strategic complex of insurrectional movements coordinated and oriented over the mid to long term towards ultimate objectives. Then we could say that revolt suspends historical time. It suddenly institutes a time in which everything that is done has a value in itself, independently of its consequences and of its relations with the transitory or perennial complex that constitutes history. A revolution would instead be wholly and deliberately immersed in historical time. End of quote. See, revolution within historical time, even though it might be counter-historical, revolt suspension of historical time. Of course, the echo that I heard immediately was the entry into this hidden chamber of history, however destructive, no? This is also can be very destructive and very dangerous, reveals itself as messianic. Messianic would here be, if I were to translate it in more profane language, I would say suspension of historical time. Benjamin's signifier of the messianic can be used here. So unlike traditional Marxism, this type of insurrection or revolt is a fight against history, against one's historical tendency, a rebellion against the so-called objective laws of historical development. And as a footnote, Marx might have called it a Don Quixoterie, if you remember the famous line from Grundrisse, when he says, if we are not fighting in a certain way within that tendency of development of productive forces, every attempt to open a different future will be a Don Quixoterie. So the act of suspending historical time, however, has historical effects, as we know. Names that come to mind and that are also shared in the writings of Jesi and Benjamin are, of course, Spartacus, Thomas Münzer, you remember also Ernst Bloch's book, Auguste Blanqui, Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, and of course the Spartacus League and the uprising, but also more recent figures like the Palestinian writer, activist and martyr Basil al-Araj. Al-Araj, you have heard of him probably. He, like all the others, they revolted against their times and they lost their struggles. In the case of Al-Araj, he was killed by Israeli troops in 2017. I'm quoting here from a posthumously translated text that was translated last year. It's called Exiting Law and Entering Revolution. You find it online. And he writes, the beginning of every revolution is an exit from the social order that power has enshrined in the name of law, stability, public interest, and the greater good. Every social and economic authority necessarily intersects with and is an extension of political authority. This is how these heroic figures can be understood and appreciated by the general public, who are overpowered as though by instinct. From there, we understand the hostility of social, economic, and political authority towards these figures, and its use of the law as a tool to tarnish their image and criminalize them. We therefore also understand the smooth transition from the outlaw into the revolutionary, the one who resists. End of quote. In the preface to the English translation, as I mentioned, from 2024, the New York-based collective, The Bad Side, comments on this text. It's a longer preface. Exiting Law and Entering Revolution, so the text from which I quoted, inquires into the link between the figure of the outlaw or bandit and the subjectivity of the revolutionary. Among the allusions to the Palestinian revolutionary Sheikh Izzeddin al-Qassam, the Syrian writer Hanna Minna, and the Algerian rebel Ali La Pointe, whose death reproduced at the end of Gillo Pontecorvo's The Battle of Algiers, bears actually a striking resemblance to Al-Araj's own. There are also references to Malcolm X and Eric Hobsbawm, militant intellectuals of the global north, which is to say that as the Gaza catastrophe sends shockwaves shooting across the world, compelling us to renew our essential commitment to liberation, we are not simply looking at Palestine. Palestine looks back at us. And of course, it is that reversal of perspective that reminded me of Benjamin. It's not that we historicize past defeated struggles, but that these struggles speak to us and historicize or perspectivize us. So this inversion. Of course, now you could say one can continue the line of rebels, martyrs, bandits, and their deeds, especially think about Thomas Münzer, but also maybe even go that far and think of Heinrich von Kleist, Michael Kohlhaas. What they all share is a certain mode of defeat that magnified their actions and image over centuries, even as some of them were forgotten for long periods. Their defeats bear witness to the incompleteness of history, whose victorious course could have been different. However, their defeated courses are not stuck in the irrealis of the could have been. They had an effect that lives on in the actuality of current struggles. Conversely, current struggles intervene in the image and meaning of those past defeated struggles. Benjamin demonstrated how political action retroactively changes the modality of each present's unfulfilled past. The site of this retroaction is, of course, class struggle. Again, I quote from Benjamin, this is thesis 4, also very famous. Class struggle, for which a historian schooled in Marx is always in evidence, a fight for the crude and material things, without which no refined and spiritual things could exist. But these latter things, which are present in class struggle, are not present as a vision of spoils that fall to the victor. They are alive in this struggle as confidence, courage, humor, cunning, and fortitude, and have effects that reach far back into the past. In other words, through virtues like confidence, courage, humor, cunning, and fortitude, the current class struggle can modify its relation to the past. Besides being a struggle for the crude and material things, class struggle also imparts a medium through which lost struggles of the past are present in current struggles. And vice versa, the retroactive effect that the present has on the past corresponds to a claim that the past has on the present. So again, this is the inversion. The past talks back. Or also the past defeat in the present talks back. If you want the ruins, the debris talks back. These anachronic modifications of the relation of past and present cannot be registered objectively, of course, but can only be collectively channeled in the uneven course of class struggle. Referring to the Spartacus Bund of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, Benjamin affirms the collective affect of past failed revolutions in terms of hatred and the spirit of sacrifice. For, as we have quoted before, for both are nourished by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than by the ideal of liberated grandchildren. In this sense, only the struggling oppressed class is what Benjamin called the avenger that completes the task of liberation in the name of generations of the downtrodden. Those negative affects of the past, however powerless and defeated they may be, already had a transformative effect on their own past and still reverberate in our present. Their echoes are channeled through the affective medium of what Benjamin called the tradition of the oppressed. Rather than fetishizing the image of failed struggles, as left-wing melancholy would do, this partisan tradition actualizes a weak potentiality of past failures in order to change the modality of the present. It is not that the present historicizes and changes the past according to its own demands, but on the contrary, the past puts the present into perspective, relativizes and deconstructs the image of the present as the necessary outcome of history. A footnote, of course, here would be today's memory politics is the exact opposite. It is the manipulation of the past according to the demands and needs of the present. So you create then memory without history. So it's not a struggle against history or suspension of historical time, it's the post-historical fantasy of modulating the past according, today it's called narrative and so on, a kind of the relativism of the master's eye, everyone according to their own memory. So it's really the opposite, but this would be a next paper. It would be probably a paper on a critique of memory culture with Enzo Traverso, and we should connect this critique with a critique of the human rights discourse by Robert Meister. I wrote this in a recent paper, so sorry, I cannot annoy you with too many arguments here. But this would be the long footnote. But let's go back to Benjamin and his language. So Benjamin's take on revenge is not surprising. Remember, there is revenge and there is weak messianic force. You know, of course, who are the readers who like more which formulation. So Benjamin's take on revenge is not surprising given his reading of Marx. In a speech from 1856, Marx understood the non-reciprocal revenge as a counterfactual affect and integral force can actually have efficacy in the historical materialist concept of history. I know the text is a bit apocryphal, as you know. The text, this is the speech at People's newspaper in London in 1856, was later written, and we don't know actually what he had said in this speech. But according to the notes that we have through Engels, it reads, Marx said, "I know the heroic struggles of the English working class have gone through since the middle of the last century. Struggles less glorious because they are shrouded in obscurity and worked by the middle class historian. To revenge the misdeeds of the ruling class, there existed in the Middle Ages in Germany a secret tribunal called the Femgericht. If a red cross was seen on a house, people knew that its owner was doomed by the Feme. All the houses of Europe are now marked with a mysterious red cross." There's a lot to say about that, and of course, in a different setting, you can also have a pogrom out of this. I mean, it's a dangerous path to go. But, of course, Marx's prediction here is, this is a prophecy for what the bourgeoisie has to expect. So such a secret tribunal has no formal or formalizable legal code. It does not comply with the rules of official world history. To quote again from Basil al-Arash, such tribunals exit the law and enter revolution. Such a revolution, however, in Furio Yesi's formulation, has the temporal structure of a revolt. It does not rely on strategic plans for the future, iron laws of history, but on hidden, irregular forces, elf or kobold-like figures such as Robin Goodfellow, actually mentioned here in the text by Marx, or, you know, the other one, the old mole, who digs underground time tunnels where the surface of the ruling class denies revolutionary justice. In other words, the act of revolution as revolt and the affective time of revenge can bridge hundreds of years, short-circuiting disparate and seemingly unrelated events. Nothing could be further away from vulgar Marxist and social democratic beliefs in revolution as the quasi-automatic mechanism of progressive world history. The temporal form of extra-legal historical justice cannot be mapped from the perspective of the law, the modern state and its violence, and of course not from its temporality of what Benjamin called homogeneous empty time. With Yesi, we can conclude that the particular temporal form of the revolt also remains invisible from the perspective of revolution, as envisioned by party socialism. And again, I quote from his text on the Spartacus uprising. Unlike revolution, which stems from the internal contradictions of society, overthrown in a precise dialectical relation that corresponds to the today, or at most to the tomorrow, revolt conserves from the past inheritances so heavy as to exclude a genuine dialectic. It's a very weird sentence. So heavy, saturated with past, I was tempted to say dialectic at a standstill, but you know, this is Benjamin's phrase. And it goes on, the quote. In some cases, revolt can be judged politically only on par with reaction. It is a lost battle and often a serious break in revolutionary strategy. And yet, precisely because it excludes the dialectic of the contradictions internal to capitalism, but allows for the violent epiphany of the reactionary components in the hands of the rebels, it conjures up the day after tomorrow. It conjures up its epiphany. What relations does that epiphany entertain with historical reality? To what extent does the epiphany of the day after tomorrow caused by revolt contribute to the overthrowing of capitalism? Interesting question mark here. Of course, I would ask also. Okay, end of quote. So paradoxically, the day after tomorrow, this revolt, bit of our suspension of historical time, is not about tomorrow, but, as he writes in a different passage, prepares the tomorrow. It would be interesting to know what this preparation is. Maybe counterfactual. In this sense, the day after tomorrow is loaded with the past and its inheritance, an inheritance that can only be passed on or transmitted by what Benjamin calls the tradition of the oppressed. In line with the retroactive force of affective time, what is inherited is not an accomplished and sealed testament, but something that is changed in the very act of accepting it as testament. As Rebecca Comey comments on Benjamin, what we are registering here relates to the retroactive force of testation. The heir generates his or her own inheritance. It's a quote from her text on Benjamin. Reading Yezi with Benjamin and Comey, we might conclude that the revolt, while being defeated and preparing the time of the day after tomorrow, also evokes an epiphany in which attestation from the past is generated in real time, so to speak. In the action itself, the attestation arrives. So you have the both directions, no? It's not that you write testament on behalf of a defeated past. In this way, the revolt lays bare the peculiar logic of historical time in Benjamin, a temporality that is open, fractured, and curved in a non-linear way. Seen from this perspective, the temporal form of the law and the state is not historical in the strict sense. If affective time is real, history is incomplete in a radical sense. Its texture is woven out of struggles, catastrophes, and failures, as well as insurrections and revolts, and actually resurrections as well. Relying on a specific link between time, affect, and collectivity, Benjamin is careful not to affirm all kinds of collective pathemata, passions. However, he acknowledges their efficacy. Politics and affect, truth and myth, cannot be clearly separated. To this respect, Benjamin echoes Gramsci's parallel reading of Croce's Passion and Sorelian myth. Here would be a long footnote on Gramsci. I just read it recently. His comments on Croce and on Sorelian myth. And also one should distinguish here myth and mythology or mythologization. And again, go back to Yezi, but this is something you may help me or we can talk about later. By the way, it's also interesting for Benjamin, who actually has many arguments against myth from the position of truth. And we have to, it's not clearly distinguished, though. He has not, let's say, Platonic theory of truth. But let's leave it here for the moment. So the affective medium of past struggle imparts a message, irreducible to the specific characteristics of the historicizable events and speech acts of its leaders. In a radical sense, there is nothing to be learned from past failures, no solace to be found, no instructive narrative to be told, no future utopia to be envisioned, no ideology to be distilled. Within the discontinuum of what Benjamin calls the tradition of the oppressed, The failed slave rebellion of ancient Spartacus and the failed Spartacist uprising of 1919 have only one thing in common: their attempt to interrupt the course of oppressive history, or suspend historical time, if I use Yesi's term. The fractured medium that connects and separates these disparate struggles only transmits its own immediacy, not in order to museumize, put into museum, past failures, but to set them free. Or, put differently, if the historical materialist task of blasting open the continuum of history only comes into perspective from within class struggle, then the disruptive fight for the crude and material things is the affective medium that enables a properly historical perspective on the past. And of course, this leaves us here with a contradiction within the tradition of the oppressed. On the one hand, it is a tradition with transmission or testation, of which creates its own heritage of interruption and revolt. So certain continuity in history, even though it is against history. And on the other hand, it establishes the transmissive link between past, present and future struggles and their defeats, essential for any authentic concept of history. So discontinuity versus continuity. In line with this contradiction, Benjamin proposed a dialectical understanding of the notion of tradition. And this is from Benjamin's notes on the thesis on the concept of history, which actually are not included in the English translation. Basic aporia, he writes here. It's crossed out passages. Tradition as the discontinuum of the past, in contradiction to history as the continuum of events. Dash. It may be that the continuum of tradition is semblance, but then precisely the persistence of this semblance of persistence provides it with continuity. Super Benjamin sentence, no? Again, crossed out. Basic aporia, he starts again. The history of the oppressed is a discontinuum. Dash. The task of history is to get hold of the tradition of the oppressed. Full stop. Crossed out. More on these aporias, he cannot let go, no? The continuum of history is the one of the oppressors, whereas the idea or Vorstellung of the continuum levels everything to the ground. The idea of the discontinuum is the foundation of real tradition. Again, crossed out. He went on with a different formulation in the end. So what Benjamin addresses here in terms of aporias relates back to the contradictory meaning of tradition. As the proverb has it, tradition is not to preserve the ashes, but to pass on the flame. Its root, the Latin verb tradere, conveys a variety of meanings, the most common of which is to hand down, transmit, to pass on. However, tradere also denotes surrender, giving away, even betrayal. This last meaning could give us a hint of how Benjamin conceives of the tradition of the oppressed. Tradition does not establish continuity through transmission, but is a discontinuum fitted by lack, privation, and betrayal. However, he claims that the fractured medium of the tradition of the oppressed is not only negative, for history also transmits a redemptive, and now comes the famous signifier, messianic force. But how are we to detect this force, and who is the we in this case? And maybe I will end here with, this is also another quote from Benjamin's notes. The historical materialist who investigates the structure of history performs, in his way, a sort of spectrum analysis. Just as a physicist determines the presence of ultraviolet light in the solar spectrum, so the historical materialist determines the presence of a messianic force in history. Whoever wishes to know what the situation of a redeemed humanity might actually be, what conditions are required for the development of such a situation, and when this development can be expected to occur, poses questions to which there are no answers. He might just as well seek to know the color of ultraviolet rays. Of course, very nice formulation. But one short comment, and I will stop. Such messianic spectral analysis may bring an invisible color to the fore. If the light of history also transmits messianic rays, then the medium in which they are imparted and discontinuously passed on is the tradition of the oppressed. This medium is not continuous, transparent, and neutral, but discontinuous, opaque, and politically partisan. Its texture is woven out of struggles, empty spots, disjointed elements, which cannot be represented in one transmittable image or inscribed into one multifaceted yet coherent world history. In this sense, the metaphor of continuous rays might be misleading. It does not come as a surprise that the final version of the thesis does not talk about the messianic light, as you know, splinters of messianic time. Moreover, with the messianic force in history, the boundaries of natural sciences, image space, are reached. For Benjamin's historical materialist cannot count on scientific laws. Unlike a physicist, he or she has no measurement at hand to pursue a messianic spectral analysis of history. The fractured medium in which history will have been told is bound to a partisan experience and perspective. For only the tradition of the oppressed imparts a genuine historical image of the past. And of course, this is why Benjamin remains a fierce critic of the humanist idea of cultural heritage, politics, culture of commemoration. I just mentioned it. Maybe I could actually stop here. I mean, now I would have to start with Enzo Traverso as a critique of memory culture of post-1989. But maybe one more remark before I really shut up. The signifier of the messianic. Don't forget, thesis on the concept of history was not intended for publication. This is something of a stand-in. I will not say it's an empty signifier, it's actually a signifier loaded with meaning, too much meaning I would say, overdetermined. But it should not be read as, especially today when we have a different meaning of the messianic, we should not read it as something of a stable force or something of a redemptive promise. It is precisely, let's say, the empty imprint left by an attempt to suspend historical time. But there is a trajectory in that. Because a secret teleology, sorry for the Kantian Hegelian term, I would say this is the messianic. Even if you will say any predication, the messianic is, every predication is wrong because the very grammatical structure already is defeated by the very idea of what the messianic is. But so to speak, these messianic rays or ultraviolet light are the, may call it, negative imprint of these failed attempt at interrupting time, historical time, or if you want to call it with Jesi, these are the steps of preparing the day after tomorrow and what they have left. I would say this is his spectrum analysis. I will end here. Okay, thank you for your attention and sorry for being super long.
Yeah, we have just one mic, so we have to pass it around.
Are there any is it all? Okay. Are there any questions, comments? Otherwise, I have one. So, well, maybe it is a bit provocative, but it was so a good talk that I cannot contest anything. So, well, if we think this distinction between revolt and revolution, so that only in revolt seems to lie the possibility of marking a change because of the real suspension and reopening of history. My question is then, is not that we are always in this way preparing the day after tomorrow, but in a sense, postponing it in a undefined way, because if there is no strategic attempt to change, to divert the course of history, making another history possible, it is like if we are doomed to fail every time with no real possibility of change. So an undermining of the real revolutionary change.
Yes, exactly. And this is exactly the problem of this entire approach. Look at all these people were defeated. Most people wrote after the defeated revolution. The text of Yezi is from 1969, and of course he was in Paris. So these are all defeated positions. The paradoxical argument, though, is that I would still call it dialectics, because I don't think dialectics is this evolutionist machine that they think. So, or put it this way, the dialectics of revolt and revolution includes a non-dialectical moment. The non-dialectical moment is heaviness of the past, or the something that cannot be bequeathed, like the inheritance which creates its own act of testation. So there is something non-dialectical in it. Totally go with that. I think this argument could even include Benjamin, maybe Bataille, and famous critics of, let's say, a vulgar understanding of what historical dialectics is according to strategy, plan, contradiction, resolution, and so on and so on. But the point that you are making is, in the end, a political one on, let's call it, meta strategy. At the one hand, you need to rely on long-term proposals, envision a future, and so on. But I think they should be informed at the same time through precisely these, you can say, gaps or deadlocks that had been produced through revolt. So what I'm proposing, of course, is against the grain of the, let's call it, anti-dialectical vision, which is also very Manichaean. So you heard these truth, false, life, death. Of course, these are the moments, almost eschatological moments at the end of a struggle or in the moment of defeat. But I would propose there is a dialectics precisely between these two moments. And it is not the work of theory to determine dogmatically, I go with revolution or I go with a revolt. A real revolution and actually a real strategy must include these, let's say, non-linear, non-dialectical moments of attempts at interrupting history. But what do I mean by this? So there is an after-image. Earlier I said there is no ultraviolet light, even the metaphor is wrong. But there is something of a, I think there is a kind of epiphany for people in a revolt. But the epiphany transmits something which, don't get me wrong, I would call it a corrective or a remodulation of what otherwise would be political revolutionary strategy. So a strategy within history that aims at something outside of the history so far. A bit of a classic Marxian approach. No, you go with historical currents in order to finish prehistory, in order to enter history proper. So something, it would still be, I think the ambiguity you find also in Marx, especially in the earlier ones, also when he is defeated with his bets on, especially think about the Brumaire, 18th Brumaire text. So I have no real answer for this, but I would say there is a dialectics between these two, let's call it, conceptions of history or of historical time. And it's not, let's throw the dice. When we are defeated, let's go with revolt. When we are still having political coherence and strategy, let's go with revolution. It's both. But I think the configuration is always a different one. And the thing is, what do we actually do with generation of the downtrodden? What do we do with the image of, what he says, enslaved ancestors? What kind of, is this just for going on, holding up, or what is it? I mean, of course, I think of the Palestinian struggle. Here you can say standing on the ground as partisan is the only way to win, so not being defeated. But what images are created? What is transmitted or what intersects there? Basil al-Arash's text is so remarkable because basically what he talks about is all the revolutionaries that talk to him in this moment of defeat. You can of course say his defeat was not a glorious one. Of course not. He rebelled against the PA, the Palestinian Authority. He was already put on the side, and in the end he was finished off by, I think, an Israeli commando, stormed the apartment and shot him. So what was left? But he said, I have found my answers through the study of these revolutionaries, revolts that were failed revolts. And there is something, I think, beyond inspiration, I would say. Beyond that, just look, there are other people who have failed. There is something of a, let's call it, objective epiphany in a certain struggle that maybe was addressed, you may say in wrong language, but still was addressed in Sorelian myth, which, can also be taken in a completely different direction. As you know, he had also some fascist readers and fans. So I believe in this, and I think this is something, I don't believe in it, I would say this is the dialectics that I need, or the dialectical optics that I need. Maybe you would say dialectics is the wrong term, may call it parallax, something that you cannot totalize, these two different approaches. I don't know.
Thank you.
No, just because it may be kind of follow up to the question and the answer on revolt and revolution. Because I was thinking, I see that I thought you were kind of dismissing the temporality of revolution to advocate revolt, and you just say that it's not the case. But I'm still doubting whether this sort of inscription of the temporality of, revolution being that which is completely immersed into history and into some sort of historicism, and then having revolt as this insurgent moment. I'm wondering if this is like the sort of characterization of the revolution that I like. And I was thinking that, for example, if you think about Ben Said, who's also a Benjaminian scholar, the very idea that revolution would be this insurgent moment. So you don't, maybe what I don't like is the idea that revolution needs to be absorbed into the historicist time, not just the long term, because again, you can have a long term without necessarily falling back into historicism. And I think that in Ben Said you have an understanding of the revolution, which is precisely the interruption of time, that now through Yezi you're naming revolt. My, not hostility, but my skepticism towards revolt, maybe it's also influenced by, authors like Kristeva, for whom then revolt becomes this insurgent, but almost individualist, like erotic moment that kind of completely dismiss the idea of political organization. So this emphasis on spontaneism, and even if you think about the Spartacus League, I think that what is dismissed is the idea that there is a sort of cumulative work, which is the work of organization. Militantism has almost the boredom of it, like brushing thick, the daily activity that is constantly repeated. I don't know if this is anti-messianic because it speaks of a sort of cumulative time where you add up in a preparatory way. And I think this is something, maybe I'm not with Benjamin, or I'm not Benjaminian enough to being able to dismiss this component that to me is essential to strategic revolutionary perspective, the cumulative work of organizing. But that said, the question is, would you agree with Ben Said that indeed revolution does not need to be left into this historicist absorption, and we can think of revolution as this interruption of time? So we don't necessarily need revolt to think of insurgent time or suspension of time. That's one question. The other one has to do with memory politics, memory culture, and traverso. Maybe I want to hear more what you have to say about that, but I was also wondering if the key I mean, Traverso is not against memory. It's against the cultural industry of memory, or against the presentism, which is a sort of trap for the way in which memory is institutionalized. The idea is not let's forget, or let's not remember, or let's do away with memory. It's rather maybe advocating for a different partisan practice of memory. So the issue wouldn't be against, I mean, I guess we agree on that it's not against memory or pro-memory. It's rather the partisan standpoint from which we reorganize memory, pretty much in line with this idea of tradition as discontinuity. The discontinuity of tradition is precisely because tradition is not just a given physiological accumulation that we receive. It's a selective partisan process of, discontinuously selecting what we want to remember, when we want to locate us or inscribe us, and what kind of tradition we reconstruct partisanly. Does it make sense?
I have this thingy. Wonderful question, Jamila. In a way, I answered kind of the first part with your question, Julia. But one more time, of course, this is exactly where one should have the, let's say, the argument. I said, dialectically include revolt in what revolution is. But that is just a slogan. What does it mean? What does it mean? The book is very clear, Jesi's book, about you didn't do your homework in terms of, sorry to say that, objective conditions for revolution. You were just too early here. It's clear that you were defeated. Still, the book makes an argument. There is a strange counter, whatever, historical preparation of the day after tomorrow in the imprint that it left. So it doesn't mean that you can have an ex post teleology. Our sacrifices were worth it in order to prepare the steps that we can only see from an afterward. This is, of course, the danger of this kind of celebration of the spontaneism of epiphany. And, of course, we should fully reject the crypto-existentialist celebration of such moments in pseudo-radical bourgeois literature of today. Sorry, that's why I don't do Benjamin today anymore. That's only why, okay, there's internet, but still, this is a small circle of people who know when I say those signifiers. I don't talk about this stuff anymore for years, and I will also not do this anymore, because I know precisely what Benjamin has become, this poster boy of bourgeois academia using pseudo-radical terminology in order not to engage precisely in the accumulative steps of realpolitik that are actually needed so much today, and the left totally lacks. And Benjamin, even though he criticized left-wing melancholy, is part of it. Traverso's point is interesting because he defends left-wing melancholy in a very interesting manner. I will answer this in a moment. But first, I think you have made this point very clear with Ben Said. This is my position as well. But my question to you remains, what to do with those revolt suspension of time moments? We don't have to give them these messianic splinters, particle, ultraviolet rays. Forget the language. We can go for something else. I'm really up to. But this is my question. Remains open maybe for later. But the Traverso's point that I like a lot is, and that's why I read him. I mean, I don't read him only as Traverso. I read him as a corrective to the argument of Robert Meister. Robert Meister has this theory that the human rights discourse comes with the fantasy of history is over. It's this typical 1990s post and 2000s discourse. Evil is past, we are good, and past is evil. So evil is in the past. There is discontinuity of past and present, and this is why we are the masters of the narrative of history, but in a post-historical situation. So memory politics is predicated on this fantasy of past evil. That's we have human rights discourse, and now we have different world order. Now we don't go engage anymore in the vicious cycle of violence and counter-violence. We are done with 200 years, 1789 to 1989, struggle for revolution, a struggle for justice. Now we do peace, conflict management, transitional justice. We are done with this stuff. Then, in this post-historical fantasy, memory politics and cultural history of memory becomes a thing. So what Traverso actually wants us to go back to, or what he wants to mobilize, is that pain, he says melancholy, okay, we can talk about it. I have other more Freudian, Lacanian readings, but regardless, he wants us to rechannel the pain and the suffering of real defeat, to go back to the moment of history. And history fissured by lack or by revolt, let's call it this way. In order, then we can have to give memory a place within history, within a historical, now contradicting, seemingly contradicting, but I said history dialectically includes here the temporality of the suspension of historical time of revolt. So, to this degree, I really like his book, also his last one on Gaza, before Faces History, Gaza Faces History. Yeah, this is a very strong argument, but again, I need Robert Meister's analysis of the hegemony of human rights discourse to understand the place of memory in our times. And if you read the three together, actually, then you can come up with a dialectical concept of history. By the way, also Meister refers to Benjamin. Mainly he refers to him to say, what do we do with defeat? What do we do in between two events with defeat and with the people who, if you allow me the Hegelian, it's wrong, of course, but imagine what is to be done with the people who come to Weltgeschichte is Weltgericht, who come to judgment, to the court with their defeated histories. And the Hegelian answer would be, yeah, you are a part of as failure. You are part of it. Don't worry. You are part. No, nobody is lost here. But they would still say no and say that place is not. This actuality of my defeat is not what I wanted. So they would actually come with a heavy inheritance that doesn't want to be dialectically, I know, vulgar Hegelianism, be swallowed and sublated in that I have been given my actuality and I should shut up. So there is this fantasy of this imaginary world judgment court. Who are the people who say no? No? So something is channeled in the affect of melancholy. I think that's why Traverso also goes back, and that's why Meister refers to it. And I refer to it more in the spirit of, sacrifice, hatred, and I had all these guys, should also be, of course, one woman at least. But you know what I mean. So, but there is something about it. I don't want to dismiss it, because otherwise I also have the more Hegelian argument on that. What do you want? You have your actuality in world history, precisely as defeat. Yeah, but what do you do then if there is a secret teleology that goes from it's a history of violence and distraction? Yeah, you have Adorno's question now.
I think we might only time for one.
Sorry, yeah, my answers were too long.
We take the other comments
Yes.
for the
Okay.
Okay. Sami is very quick.
Very short, Sami, thank you. I totally agree with you about the issue of temporality, but speak on the class struggle in terms of class, because in Iesi it's clear, you said the text, it was not published in the 69, so it is clear a diffidence or a criticism of Iesi about the possible relationship between the social movements, revolt, and the party, the revolution, the organization. No? This gap, you say, there is not possible to reduce. In Benjamin, the question is a little bit more complicated, because we have to think that in the text, in the issue on surrealism, he's put together revolt and revolution. But which is the revolt in this text? The surrealist revolt. So the avant-garde of bourgeoisie class. And the revolution is the proletarian organization, so the party. So sometimes I think that in Benjamin, the part of the revolt is a kind of self-destruction of bourgeoisie culture. It's you have think about also the journal, no, Crise und Kritik, the bourgeoisie avant-garde intelligentsia has to destroy its same culture, its same civilization.
Destructive character.
Yeah, destructive character is a trait of bourgeoisie culture, the destructive character. So I think about that today we have to reverse this point of view. The revolt is not so self-destructive, but has to take the role of the subaltern, not this kind of self-destruction of the bourgeoisie, of the ruling class. Because I think that in Benjamin, revolt has also this kind of point of view. In the thesis, he doesn't speak about revolt, but only on revolution.
Yes, I agree, and thank you. This is a very important also addendum or corrective to what I have said. Benjamin and Brecht here think of experience and poverty, destructive character, are still involved in liquefying in a destructive moment the stock of heritage that bourgeois culture has left them. So what is today our perspective is not. Our perspective is the missing leg of this Nadia character, 13 years old in 1956. This is our perspective. What do you do with this missing leg, and what of post-bourgeois, let's say post-revolutionary politics, or what kind of revolt/revolution you can do in post-revolutionary times with the memory of the presence of the missing leg, or the memory of the leg. What do you do with this? And it doesn't look good, but I agree it needs, let's say, constructive political strategy, not to regain the missing limb, but to do something with those people who are the survivors of the last phase of this bourgeois universe, global capitalism. And of course the ruling bourgeoisie is much more violent even than at the time of Benjamin. So I agree that even though I love the literature, I love I'm a big fan, let's say, of the avant-garde art and literature, and to this degree I'm a reader of the surrealism essay always, but as a political strategy this has been aestheticized already. The moment where this could have been realized, sorry to make Adorno's point, has been missed, or this was there already. So if you cling on to this is more of a melancholic attachment, detachment. It's nice to talk about the specters of Marx with Derrida once Marx is dead, in the 90s. That's why he writes it so late. So against all of this, I still think as a corrective, again, I'm going to revisit in the moment of defeat how people have reacted to this. So all of this, what you said, is true, but I still would not dismiss, let's say, the negative corrective function of this stock of literature. But it makes meaning, has only meaning if I understand what is my position in history today. And here I agree with you completely.
One quick question.
Okay.
Just very, very quick. I mean, and we'll continue this in the roundtable, but the point you make about Ali Lapointe is very pertinent here, because Ali Lapointe, of course, he dies at the end of the film, and the whole perspective is seen from his point of view, but he is a subaltern, right? He doesn't form part of the caterers of the FLN. He is, he's a common thief, he's a gambler, and then he gets the film elevates him to the role of hero, but the whole thing, it's memorial, but not in the sense of memory politics. So for me, I think you made a really good point, Jamila, when you were saying that there's this risk of individualism and spontaneism, but I was very convinced by what you were saying, because there has to be a role for subalterns entering history to some extent that are not part of I guess you could call it an avant-garde, in the sense that just like Gramsci is trying to recuperate fragments of a subaltern history where they have not yet arrived at political consciousness, right? But you do want to give validity, though. This is how I was reading it, that you want to give validity to their struggles. Mm-hmm. You want to somehow recognize that they have a historical significance. I mean, I'm putting it in very sort of basic language, but the point of Ali Lapointe was very clear to me. You can also you can sort of valorize subjectivity in specifically like anti-colonial struggle, right? So it's not just, it somehow restores agency to those who have fought for the freedom of Algeria, for example, and who may not have had the language to speak of it. I don't know, I mean, obviously we're entering very difficult territory here about, can the subaltern speak? And obviously Pontecorvo's films has its own problems, but I felt that was an example of revolt. In fact, so you have the backdrop, right, of the Algerian Revolution, and you have the historical narrative of the FLN and the general strike and the various acts, but Ali Lapointe has that epiphanic and a messianic aspect in the film, I think. Anyway, sorry, yeah, I know we're running late, so...
A super good point, which actually wraps up my entire argument. This is meant by the tradition of the oppressed. I would say this is a kind of a counterintuitive cunning of reason. The real revolutionary is not the intended one, it's the thief. It's the gangster or whoever, the gambler. Think about the repertoire of figures that Bertolt Brecht brings to the stage, who accidentally takes on that figure, and of course later has the echo, needs of course a certain validation and so on and so on. But I think this is the real revolutionary. It's very counterintuitive that there is a shift, a change. But again, then we are back to what is the political strategy. If the gambler, if let's say the one who is a petty criminal and has a career, out of a sudden as this is going to be defeated. So from our perspective then, the meaning of this deed is the film and the reception and the story that we can tell. Then of course you have given up on the actual revolution back in the days, which isn't the past for us. But I totally can accept both. I can accept both. The image of the tradition of the oppressed as subaltern whose deeds speak, is then the meaning of this event. Okay, but that is then for the day after tomorrow. But I still have the day and the needs of tomorrow and the day of today for politics, and so I cannot say either or. But again, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.